There comes a point in life when you look in the mirror and realize the face staring back at you is not entirely your own. It smiles like you. It speaks like you. It moves through the world like you've trained it to. But something about it feels off, like a borrowed identity, a voice memorized, not felt. A version of yourself so polished, it no longer breathes. That is the moment, quiet but irreversible, when the persona begins to crack. What you show the world may not be what you are. Most people never reach that moment. Not because they're not deep, not because they don't want truth, but because they've been taught to confuse performance with presence. From the moment we enter the world, we begin the slow art of becoming acceptable. We study the room, we read the rules, and we shape ourselves into what is welcomed. A child doesn't say, "I feel sad." They say, "Look, I'm okay." A teenager doesn't say, "I'm lost." They say, "I've got it all figured out." An adult doesn't say, "This job is killing me." They say, "I'm just grateful to have work." Every time we silence the voice of our inner world to meet the expectations of the outer one, a new layer of persona is born. Persona is survival dressed as personality. We call it confidence. We call it politeness. We call it maturity. Put often it is simply fear, with a well-rehearsed smile. It says, if they really knew me, they'd leave. If I don't perform, I'll lose my place. If I don't wear the mask, I won't survive here. And so we live behind glass, visible but untouched, applauded but unknown. The applause becomes addictive because it tells us, this version of you works. Don't change. But deep down, something is whispering, this version is not all of you. That whisper becomes heavier with time. It shows up when you laugh with everyone but feel alone afterward. It shows up when you achieve everything but feel nothing. It shows up in quiet rooms where silence becomes unbearable, because it reveals how much of your life has been curated for others. What's polished for the world may be abandoned by the soul. We don't wear the mask because we're dishonest. We wear it because we're afraid we're not enough without it. We learned early. Our anger wasn't acceptable. Our needs were too much. Our authenticity was inconvenient. So we trimmed ourselves, edited the wildness, muted the real. And eventually, we mistook the edited version for who we are. But the body remembers, the soul remembers. The parts of you that were pushed aside don't disappear. They wait. They wait in dreams you no longer chase, in emotions you can't quite name, in discomfort you can't explain, in the sudden panic that comes when everything seems fine. Sometimes emptiness isn't a lack, it's a buried self. Knocking, there's a price to living only as the persona, and it's not just exhaustion, it's disconnection. You begin to forget how to cry deeply, how to speak honestly, how to say, I don't know who I am when I'm not performing. But this forgetting is not permanent. Beneath the rehearsed lines is a truth that still breathes, not loudly, not urgently, but consistently. The true self doesn't force its way back. It waits for you to be quiet enough to notice its absence. And that's the paradox. The more you run toward becoming who the world wants you to be, the further you drift from the one person who actually matters, yourself. There is no peace in being everything for everyone but nothing for yourself. So what is the persona really? It's a mask, yes, but more than that, it's a strategy, a psychological armor for navigating a world that punishes difference. The problem isn't that we have a persona. Everyone does. The problem is when we forget that it's a performance, not the whole story. When we build our entire life around what looks good, instead of what feels real. When we fill our homes with smiles, but leave our hearts empty. When we say, this is who I am, but a voice inside whispers, This is who you became to be safe. Persona is the echo of safety, not the sound of truth. There comes a moment when the soul can't play along anymore. It begins to protest, not through words, but through fatigue, through unexplained sadness, through a persistent feeling that something is missing. You might think, maybe I need a new job, maybe a new partner, maybe a new city, but the restlessness isn't about location. It's about separation. You've become too far removed from your own inner reality. The mask is smiling, but underneath, something is dying. Here's the truth most never admit. Taking off the mask is terrifying, because you don't just lose the persona, you lose the identity that came with it. The friendships built around it, the respect it earned, the belonging it provided. It's not just a mask you remove, it's a life you unravel. But what remains is real. You cannot find your true self by clinging to the version that survived. There's grief in this process. Grief for who you never got to be. Grief for the parts of you that were never welcomed. Grief for the years spent living someone else's idea of you. But there's also freedom. Because for the first time, you begin to feel your own pulse again. You speak without editing. You cry without shame. You stand without the armor. And though it feels vulnerable, it also feels alive. When the mask falls, the soul breathes. This is only the beginning. The real work begins after the performance ends. And in part 2, we'll go deeper into what happens when the mask is removed, but the true self is still unfamiliar. Keep watching the next video to continue the journey inward. But before you go, pause. What part of this stirred something in you? What role have you played for so long that you forgot who's underneath? What moment in this reflection felt real? Write it in the comments, not for attention, but as a message to yourself, because healing begins the moment you tell the truth out loud, and that truth might be the first step toward freedom. The hardest part is not removing the mask. It's standing there without it, naked, uncertain, exposed, unrecognizable, even to yourself. You spent years, maybe decades, perfecting that identity, and now in its absence, you're not quite sure what's left. You no longer feel drawn to the same people. You no longer enjoy the same conversations. You don't even react to life the same way, and that's what no one prepares you for. That space after the mask, the emptiness that follows performance, the stillness that follows noise, the discomfort of meeting the raw self you've ignored for so long. Removing the mask reveals the face, but not yet the soul, because here's the truth. The mask was clear. It had rules, expectations, rewards. But the self beneath it is chaotic. It doesn't perform on command. It doesn't please everyone. It doesn't have answers. It simply exists. And most people can't handle that. So they go back to roles, to personas, to curated identities that give them structure. They choose a life that looks whole over a life that feels honest. But if you stay with the discomfort, if you resist the temptation to rebuild the old mask, something begins to awaken. At first, it's subtle, sensation of breath that feels deeper, a thought that isn't filtered through performance, a decision that comes from truth, not expectation. It feels like remembering. The true self doesn't shout. It returns like a slow sunrise. You start to notice the difference between what's real and what's rehearsed, between desire and obligation, between the voice that guides you and the voice that manages you. And maybe for the first time, you start to feel human again. Not perfect, not polished, just present. But here's where the second mask appears, the spiritual one, the new identity that says, I am now awakened. I live in truth. I am free of ego. And if you're not careful, this too becomes a persona, a more subtle one, but a persona nonetheless. It says all the right things. It avoids conflict in the name of peace. It wears authenticity like a badge, but it's still a performance, because now you're not being who you are. You're being who the healed version of you is supposed to be. Even spiritual growth can become a performance if it's driven by image, and so the prison evolves, not with chains, but with language, not with fear, but with identity. You think I've outgrown the old mask, but you haven't left the game. Because true selfhood isn't about being enlightened. It's about being real, messy, contradictory, emotionally honest, alive in both your peace and your shadow. Not curated, not perfect, just fully here. But this kind of presence comes with a cost. You start to lose things, people, status, familiar places. Because when you start playing the game, the ones still inside it won't understand you anymore. They'll say you've changed, that you're distant, that you're hard to connect with. And maybe you are, because you finally stopped pretending to relate to what you no longer resonate with. You will outgrow more than your pain. You will outgrow the version of you that survived it. This is the loneliness of becoming whole. You stand at the edge of your old life and realize no one taught you how to be this version. There's no script for someone who no longer wants to perform. So, you begin to build something new, from nothing, from silence, from instincts that don't always make sense. You say no without apology. You rest without guilt. You cry without justification. You stop explaining yourself, because your presence is no longer a pitch. But there are moments you miss the old mask, the ease of being understood, the approval it brought, the safety of fitting in, and that's okay. Grief doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you're brave enough to walk away from what was no longer real. You can miss the comfort of the lie while still choosing the truth. This is where the deepest transformation begins, when you are no longer acting, no longer proving, no longer chasing an image. When you're simply being and trusting, that's enough. But you start to feel something else too, a kind of magnetism, a soft pull toward people, places, and moments that mirror the inner stillness you've cultivated. You don't have to impress them. You don't have to shrink for them. You don't have to manage how you're perceived. You just exist. And they see you, not as a role, not as a brand, but as a presence. It's rare, it's beautiful, and it's only possible because you were willing to lose the ones who only saw your mask. When you stop performing, the right people stop clapping and start listening. But perhaps the most unexpected thing is this. As the true self grows, you begin to meet parts of you that were never allowed to speak. The jealous part, the scared part, the angry part, the tender part. And they don't come back to ruin your peace. They come back to be loved. They come back to be felt, not fixed. Because integration isn't about improvement. It's about inclusion. You don't become whole by removing your flaws. You become whole by reclaiming what you've hidden. You realize the mask wasn't just about hiding from the world. It was about hiding from yourself. And now, there's nowhere left to hide. Wholeness begins when you stop trying to be good and start learning to be real. And that's where we'll go in part 3, into the territory of integration, of loving the fragments, of making space for the parts that once felt unacceptable. But for now, pause. Let yourself rest in the unmasking. Let the silence settle. Let the grief breathe. And ask yourself, who am I when I stop performing? What part of me have I recently met for the first time? What version of myself do I no longer need to protect? Write it down in the comments as a marker in your own journey, because naming the self is the first act of reclaiming it. Keep watching the next video to continue the journey inward, and let today's reflection root itself deeper in you. You're not just removing a mask, you're remembering a face, and that face is yours. There is a quiet power in meeting yourself without expectation, not the self you wanted to become, not the one you planned, improved, or edited, but the one that's been patiently waiting beneath all the noise. The one who never needed to prove anything. The one who never had to perform. That self, raw, uncertain, undivided, doesn't shine with brilliance. It hums with presence, and that is enough. But we don't reach this place by accident. We arrive here through loss. Loss of illusion. Loss of certainty. Loss of everything we once believed we had to be. And only when we've let go of all the identities we built for approval, for safety, for control, do we begin to remember the one identity we never created, our essence. Your true self is not something you become. It's something you uncover. Integration begins in that uncovering. It is the slow reunion of all the parts you once thought made you unlovable, the ones you silenced to survive, the ones you buried to belong, the ones you labeled too much, too messy, too real. But they never left. They waited in the shadow for the day you'd stop performing long enough to feel them. And now they return, not to punish you, but to ask for a seat at the table. Anger asks to be honored, not denied. Sadness asks to be heard, not hidden. Fear asks to be held, not judged. The more you welcome them, the more whole you become. Not perfect, not unshakable, just whole. Wholeness isn't about light. It's about including your darkness. But this part of the journey is often misunderstood. People think awakening is about peace, about clarity, about finally being free from pain. But real awakening is heavier than that, because it requires you to feel what you've numbed for years. It's not about escaping suffering. It's about making space for it, without running, without masking, without managing it away. You sit in the storm and let it pass through you, not as a victim, not as a warrior, but as someone finally home. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, the process of becoming a whole human being, not a perfected one, but an integrated one. Someone who has looked at every part of themselves and said, "You are allowed to exist." True freedom is not being fearless, it's being unafraid of who you are. As you walk this path, you start to see your past differently, not as a curse, but as a curriculum. The roles you played, the personas you wore, the people you tried to please, they all taught you something about who you are not, and now you have the chance to live as who you are. Not everyone will understand this version of you. Some will say you've changed. Some will accuse you of being distant, selfish, cold. But what they're really seeing is a self they no longer know how to control. They knew the mask, they never met the soul. And that's okay. You're not here to be understood by everyone. You're here to be understood by yourself. You begin to walk differently. Not faster, not louder, but with a kind of quiet conviction that says, I no longer abandon myself to be loved. You make decisions not out of obligation, but out of alignment. You speak not to be heard, but to be honest. You rest, not because you've earned it, but because you exist. And slowly, your life begins to mirror your inner landscape. People come into your world who don't need you to be on. who don't reward your performance, who don't fall in love with your mask. They see you, and because you've made peace with your whole self, they're not a mirror of your wounds. They're a reflection of your clarity. The self you reveal determines the love you receive. But even then, this isn't the end of the journey, because every day the old mask tries to return. In moments of stress, in social situations, in the face of judgment or rejection, it whispers, "They'd like you more if you just softened the truth." It's easier to pretend than to be misunderstood. But now you notice the voice. You greet it with compassion, and you choose differently. Because now you are anchored. You no longer need to be adored. You no longer need to be everything. You just need to be true. And that is more than enough. Being whole is not the end of suffering. It is the end of pretending. There's a new kind of quiet that follows this path. Not silence from loneliness, but silence from peace. You sit in stillness and no longer ache for someone to complete you. You look in the mirror and no longer search for a better version. You simply breathe, and that's enough. And from this place, you offer something the world rarely sees. Presence, not performance, not perfection, but presence. The kind of presence that says, "I have nothing to prove. I am already home." And when others feel it, really feel it, they pause, they soften, they breathe a little deeper, because something in your truth reminds them of their own. This is the quiet revolution of the unmasked self. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand. It simply lives fully, deeply, honestly. And that is more powerful than any persona could ever be. When you live without the mask, you don't become someone else. You become who you were before the world told you who to be. So now at the end of this reflection, you stand at the same edge I once stood at. You can go back to what's familiar, to what earns applause, to what keeps the peace. Or you can choose the harder path, the one that leads inward, the one where masks are dropped, truth is honored, and presence becomes your only costume. You'll lose things, but you'll find yourself, and that is the only journey that matters. Before you go, pause, ask yourself, what mask do I still wear around those I love? What version of me is still performing to be accepted? And what would it feel like to stop? Let those questions sit in you. Let them stir something deep. And if something surfaced during this series, an emotion, a realization, a fragment of truth, write it in the comments. Not for validation, but for liberation. Because your words might mirror someone else's silence, and your honesty might remind someone that they are not alone. Keep watching the next video in this series. Let this presence become practice. And never forget, you are not here to perform. You are here to remember. And remembering is the beginning of freedom.